In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at food issues with a focus on hunger, the Green Revolution, and GMOs. The UN Millennium Development Goals aim to halve the number of people who suffer from extreme hunger and undernutrition by the year 2015. They achieved this goal, but today still about 800 million people are estimated to be undernourished. The goal of today's lesson is to better understand the causes of hunger, its realities, as well as to look at some ways that we have dealt with hunger in the past and how we may continue to combat it in the future. This lesson will be divided into three main sections. We will begin by looking at hunger in the developing world and trying to answer these questions. What is it? What causes it? And what is being done today to prevent it? Next, we will look at the Green Revolution to examine how we have overcome hunger in the past. And finally, we'll look at the new Green Revolution to see what is being done today to solve the food crisis, with a focus on GMOs. And hopefully we'll clarify some of the misconceptions surrounding this topic. So to begin with, there's a few definitions that we need to establish in order to get a better understanding of what hunger is exactly. When we're talking about hunger, we're not just talking about the feeling you get when you haven't eaten in a few hours. This is a chronic condition of undernourishment. And according to UNICEF, undernutrition is an inadequate consumption of calories, leading to a decrease in bodily function. And this is an extreme deficit in calories. The average person in the Western world is recommended to get about 2,000 calories a day. Could be more depending on levels of physical activity. When we're talking about people with undernutrition, they're getting far less than that, barely enough to survive. So, in fact, their bodily processes are severely hindered by this condition. And it's estimated that in 2015, when the UN Millennium Development Goals had aimed to cut in half the number of people living in extreme hunger, there were 795 million people undernourished. So although things are getting better, this number would have been much higher if we go back to 1990, which is when the goal would have been started. Another kind of criticism of the UN Development Goals is that even though they started in 2000, it was cut in half the number that we had in 1990, not the number in 2000. So maybe it could have been a little more ambitious. But we have made some progress. There are definitely hundreds of millions of people fewer who are hungry today than there were 15 years ago. And another concept to deal with hunger is this idea of food security, which is the ability of an individual to gain access to sufficient food. And there are many reasons why one's food security might be hindered. It might be economic. You can't afford enough food. You don't make enough money. There isn't enough food for you to get. It could also be physical. You can't physically get the food. It isn't available to you, even if you do have the money to buy food. So think about people living in Aleppo in Syria. Right now in 2016, dealing with a civil war, under siege, food can't get into that area. Even if those people could afford it, they cannot buy food because there just isn't available to them. So food security comes in many forms and is a leading cause of hunger. But at the end of the day, hunger is a human condition. We produce enough food not for the 7 billion people who live on Earth, but for at least 10 billion people. We produce far more food than we need to eat. The problem is that we don't distribute that food evenly. People in the Western world have far more food. We also send a lot of that food to be eaten by animals and livestock, which we raise for meat. So a lot of this food is going towards feeding other food. So one way of trying to solve the hunger crisis might be to, again, better distribute these resources that we have. It's not growing food and producing it that's the problem. It's how we deal with it and how we organize ourselves and how we distribute food throughout the world and throughout economies. Now, hunger has many devastating effects on an individual. So it takes a real toll on the body. And someone who's malnourished might experience stunted growth. And this begins before the child is even born. So a mother who's malnourished isn't providing nutrients to the baby as it's developing. And when they're born, they tend to be a lot smaller than we would see in a developed country with a properly nourished mother. There's also decreased cognitive development in children who are hungry. So think about how hard it is to concentrate after you haven't eaten for hours. Your stomach hurts, you might feel a little dizzy or lightheaded. It's really hard to concentrate, and that's because the brain needs energy, and the brain's energy is food. One of the things that makes brains so powerful, the human brain so powerful, is that it's big, but it requires a lot of energy. Compared to other animals, which have much smaller brains, they don't need to eat nearly as much. Even close ancestors of ours, I'm thinking of like apes and other types of like chimpanzees, our closest relative. We have 99% the same DNA as a chimpanzee. They burn something like half the calories that we do with the same activity. If we were to put a chimpanzee on a treadmill and have them walk and run on it, they would burn half the calories that we do. And the reason is because our bodies, in particular our brains, require that much more energy. Even though evolutionarily our big brains have been an asset to us as humans, the big disadvantage is it makes us eat more food. It requires a lot more fuel to function properly. And in the long term, chronic hunger can lead to decreased cognitive function. So the real long-term impact here, people who grow up hungry in these areas, they aren't able to function as well mentally into their adult years. And there's also a susceptibility to disease. Those who are hungry are more likely to become sick and to pass on disease to others, and more likely to die of diseases. And again, hunger is a human condition. It's not a natural phenomenon. It's a human-made condition. And we can tie this in a lot of ways to international trade. And there's a lot of a colonial legacy going on here. We can definitely tie it back all the way to Columbus. So once Columbus and the other explorers in the age of exploration came to the Americas, they were under the economic, political, and cultural domination of Europeans. And as you recall, colonies were created to be a source of both human and natural resources to the colony. So what this meant was that these colonies were being used and exploited for their resources. It wasn't that they were growing resources and creating them for the benefit of those who lived there. It was for the benefit of the mother country. Now, in the 20th century, as you'll recall, these colonies started to gain their independence. We started to see these national movements, and countries in Africa and Southeast Asia gained their independence from the European colonies. However, many of these countries continue to function much the same way they did before. Just because they became politically independent did not mean that their economies just shifted overnight. Many of their resources were still being developed and grown with the expectation that they were going to be sent back to the mother country. Think back to mercantilism, the idea that these resources were being created to be sent to the mother country to be manufactured into goods that people want. So many of these former colonies still to this day rely on what we would call cash crops as the basis for their economies. Now, what is a cash crop? A cash crop is any crop that is grown for export only. It's not being grown for the domestic market. So in effect, what this means is that you're using a large percentage of your resource space to grow a crop which is not being used to feed people in your country. Your economy is dependent on it. You can't just get rid of that crop or else your economy will suffer. But it also means this is taking away from the available land to grow food for your people. And this has had a direct impact on hunger historically and today. So if we think back to the Irish potato famine of the 19th century, potato blight wiping out the potato crop, which is a staple of the Irish diet, millions of people starving, but there was still food being grown in Ireland. Corn, in fact, was a major export, but it was being exported to Britain, and there were laws in place which prevented the Irish from selling it domestically. So you have this weird contradiction where the Irish are able to grow lots of food, but they aren't able to eat it, and people are starving because one crop was affected by disease. And we see this today with many cash crops. So, for example, coffee beans in Colombia, a major export for Colombia. Biofuel plants made from corn in Africa, which ethanol is made from. We can see cotton has been historically a very important cash crop. These are in places where there might not be enough food to feed locals, or there's high rates of hunger, and yet a lot of the land is being used to cultivate crops which are not even being sold domestically. Another issue related to hunger and international trade has to do with prices and resource economies. The prices of many export goods have fallen, especially when we look at them adjusted for inflation over the past 100 years. And this is a consequence of globalization. Thinking of how trade between countries and different business practices have been streamlined, costs have gone down significantly. And as a result, prices of export goods have decreased in developing nations. However, when you have a resource economy, this results in a decrease in your standard of living. When your economy is based around a primary resource where the price is fluctuating all the time, think of a commodity like wheat or other non-food related commodities like oil or gold or other metals. Their price rises and falls on the international market all the time. So if that price is to crater, it's going to have a significantly negative impact on your economy. And developing countries have tried to develop their own industries, but the West hasn't been very helpful because these countries are acting in their own self-interest. And again, with trade agreements and with organizations like the IMF, there's definitely been a lot of pressure on these countries to maintain the status quo. And it sort of brings up this question of whether or not this is economic exploitation. If you were to ask a Marxist about this, they would argue, yes, it is. You're taking advantage of these people and you're using them for their labor and you're extracting the resources from them, very similar to what we saw with colonialism, and they're not getting a whole lot out of this. But on the other hand, others would argue that this is just a phase of development. When you think about back to development theories, the resource economy is definitely one of those first stages you go through, and you rely on primary resource before you can ever develop a manufacturing center. So some people would argue that this is just, one of those first steps, and eventually these countries will grow these other industries. But there's definitely been a lot of barriers put in their way. Now, thinking of the effects of globalization on trade, let's look at one particular example of how this would affect someone working in the agriculture industry in a developing country. So let's look at the average cup of coffee. So think of like a Starbucks cup of coffee, costs about $2. This is where that money is actually going to. So 28% of the profits of that cup of coffee go to traders, brokers, and shippers. So the people who are working overseas, trading and buying and selling coffee on the international market. This could also be like stock people, businessmen who are dealing and selling in these commodities. 25% goes to processors and wholesalers. 20% goes to the retailers, so that would be your Starbucks and your Tim Hortons and your second cups. 19% goes to middlemen in the developing world. So these are people who are working overseas and are essentially facilitating the deals between the growers and the buyers. And then only 8% goes to the growers. So of that $2 cup of coffee, only about 16 cents is actually going to the people who grew the coffee beans in the first place. In terms of the workers who work on these farms, 2 cents for every kilogram of coffee picked goes to them. They usually have very few rights or benefits, and they rarely get paid until the end of a month-long harvest. So the vast majority of the money from each cup of coffee is going to businesses in other countries. There's very little wealth staying within the country that's doing the growing of these crops. So this is what we would call in economics leakages. Even though the labor is being done in one country, the wealth and the profit that's generated from that labor is leaking out into other countries. So it's going to those, companies like Starbucks and Tim Hortons, and it's going to investment bankers on Wall Street. It's not staying with the people who actually grew the coffee in the first place. So even though, again, we've developed these industries, not all the money is staying there. So it has a very limited economic benefit on these countries. And as a result of this, we've seen the rise of the fair trade movement as opposed to free trade. And so the idea of fair trade is that instead of trying to get the lowest price possible, which is what unrestrained capitalism's goal is. You want competition between people to lower the price to as low as you can possibly get it. The problem with this is that inevitably this takes away from workers' wages. So fair trade advocates suggest helping producers in developing countries achieve better, more sustainable trading conditions to make things more fair and to, again, improve the conditions of the growers and the workers on these farms overseas. Now, that's not to say that fair trade is a perfect solution. It has its critics on both the left wing and the right wing. So some would point out that there's, for example, a possibility of corruption within fair trade practices. So you can have a company that labels its product fair trade and then takes advantage of socially conscious individuals who, with the best intentions, buy a product. But when you actually trace it back to the country it's grown in, it's not actually fair trade. The workers aren't getting paid anymore. And that's a valid concern, which definitely points to the need to regulate these types of industries. So although fair trade's not perfect, it might be one solution to some of these issues. Now that we know what hunger looks like today, let's look back to the 1950s and 1960s, when the food crisis seemed much more dire. Hundreds of millions of people over the world were on the brink of starvation. This is the time that Paul Ehrlich and other neo-Malthusians were writing about the population bomb. They thought that population growth had finally outpaced food production. But with science, technology, and new agricultural methods, we saw an increase in food production during this time. And not just a modest one, a dramatic increase. This is the story of the Green Revolution. Now, the Green Revolution was a series of technological and agricultural advancements starting in the 1940s and into the 1960s that significantly increased food production, especially in developing countries. And the countries that were targeted for this revolution were Mexico, India, and Pakistan, countries that were on the poorer end of the spectrum during this time. Lots of people on the brink of starvation, large populations, fast-growing populations. They were prime targets for these new initiatives. And it was very successful in feeding these people and preventing starvation. So new technologies helped yield higher crop turnout. And these technologies included things like modern irrigation projects, the introduction of pesticides, the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and the selective breeding of crops. And the man responsible for many of these innovations is Norman Borlaug, the man pictured right here. So he was an American researcher who pioneered these techniques and brought them to Mexico, India, and Pakistan. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in 1970. The main crop that was targeted by the Green Revolution was wheat. And by using selective breeding of crops, we were able to get favorable traits out of the wheat crop. And this isn't a new concept. Humans have been doing this for thousands of years. The original wheat that we would have seen is essentially just grasses. And you can sort of apply this to other animals too. I mean, think of the foods that you eat on a daily basis. And try to think if there's a wild companion to them. In most cases, there's not. So for example, there are no wild dairy cows. There are no wild chickens with huge breasts and huge drumsticks. That's not a real thing that happens in nature. Humans did that. Humans created dairy cows by selectively breeding them over thousands of years to get the cows that produce lots of milk. Or we created wheat crops from those grasses, so instead of eating grass, we have these big, huge crops that produce lots of wheat. And the particular variety of wheat that Norman Borlaug was using was something called a semi-dwarf variety. So you can see here, the picture on the left is what this would have looked like prior to the selective breeding. It's wild. There isn't a whole lot of wheat on it. It isn't very strong. And through selective breeding, we end up with this one on the right, which it grows tall. It produces a lot of food that we can actually eat. It's stronger. It's taller. It's more disease resistant. So these are the traits that you actually want. So you keep planting the seeds of the crops that you like, the ones that have these traits. And eventually you end up with seeds which produce only these crops, the ones with the favorable traits. And there were many benefits to the Green Revolution. It was a massive success, and it's the reason that hundreds of millions of people did not starve to death in the 1960s. We saw a massive increase in crop production from these high-yield varieties. So, for example, India's wheat production jumped from 10 million tons in 1960 to 20 million tons in 1970, all the way up to 70 million tons by the 2000s. And as a result, the rates of hunger and malnutrition dropped dramatically. So the average person in the developing world consumes 25% more calories nowadays than they did before the Green Revolution. So again, really tangible benefits here from these practices. But that's not to say that the Green Revolution was without its critics. So neo-Malthusians, like Paul Ehrlich, argued in the 1960s that the Green Revolution's growth was unstable, that eventually it's going to be outpaced by population growth again, and that will lead to a mass famine. We haven't seen that to this point, and crop growth, again, continues to keep pace with population. As I mentioned earlier, we're still growing more than enough food for everyone who lives on Earth. It's a matter of distribution that seems to be the problem today. There were environmental impacts of the Green Revolution. So the loss of forests, deforestation in order to create more farmland. There's also been a criticism of the loss of biodiversity, the creation of monocultures. So a monoculture is when you have essentially one crop that you grow in a particular region. And sometimes those crops are genetically very similar or identical to one another. There's also concerns about the quality of diet. So again, this was one crop in particular, wheat, that was being targeted. So you can grow lots and lots of wheat, but that's not necessarily a great diet if all you're eating is bread and cereal and other wheat products. That's a very unvaried diet. So you're going to have, again, it's reliant on carbohydrates. There isn't a whole lot of protein or fat in that diet. You'd be trying to get them from other sources, but again, the main staple of your diet is going to be wheat. And you could also lead to micronutrient deficiencies as well in terms of the vitamins that are available in these grains. If you're relying on them too much, you're not getting them from other sources. There's not much of an emphasis on fruits and vegetables, for example. There's also health concerns related to the use of pesticides. So in one region of India, in the Punjab region, where pesticides were widely used, we saw high rates of cancer in the years after the Green Revolution took hold there. So again, there's this negative side of using pesticides. And there's also this idea of food sovereignty. So this movement came in response to the Green Revolution, and it essentially says that people have the right to define their own food and agricultural systems in a culturally appropriate manner. So they would argue that historically people in Mexico, India, Pakistan, other countries did not rely on wheat. So to force that upon them and say this is going to be your staple crop from now on is inherently wrong. Now again, this prevented people from starving to death, but there is this sort of loss of culture that goes along with that. And if there's an alternative to that, it was not explored at the time. But even though the Green Revolution was highly successful overall, we still are trying to end world hunger. So many have termed the sorts of advancements that are going on today a new Green Revolution. So these are new efforts to use science and technology to eradicate undernutrition. So today we have new problems than we did in the 1960s that are going to require new solutions. So for example, climate change seems to be the big driving factor behind a lot of our problems today. But there's lots that we can do to make sure that food production doesn't decrease because of climate change. So for example, this picture here, this is a rice crop that's being grown that can survive 2 weeks underwater. So as climate change, the effects of it get worse, we're going to see increased flooding. You're going to need crops like this that can survive underwater for, significant periods of time, so that if there's a flood, it doesn't just wipe out your entire crop. Again, using techniques like selective breeding and genetic modification, genetic engineering, in order to try to get these desirable traits so that we can produce enough food in light of these new challenges. Now, initially, there were attempts to use the same techniques from the original Green Revolution in new places such as Africa. However, they were less successful than we saw in Mexico, India, and Pakistan. And there's a variety of reasons for this, variety of social, political, economic, and environmental reasons. So what we've sort of moved on to is new methods of trying to produce more food, and many of these rely on genetic engineering, in what we would call GMOs in particular. Now, this is a word that we see thrown around a lot, but many people don't understand what a genetically modified organism actually is. A GMO is any organism that's had its genes altered in some way, in an intentional way by humans. Now again, just like selective breeding, this has been practiced by humans for thousands of years. This has been going on since the dawn of agriculture. All that selective breeding, again, to breed the dairy cows and to breed wheat from wild grasses, that's genetically modifying those crops. The only difference is that today this can be done a lot more efficiently and quickly in laboratories, so that instead of taking decades or hundreds of years to end up with those desirable traits, we can do this in a matter of years or over the course of a decade. And one major difference is that as opposed to before where we were dealing with seeds and breeding of animals and crops and livestock of the same organism, the same species, now we have the technology to transfer genes from one organism to another. So if there's a trait and we can identify it on the animal or the plant's genome, we can then implant that gene in another species to get that trait. Now it's important to clarify, GMOs are not food that have been injected with chemicals or hormones. They are not mutant foods, they are not frankenfoods. It's the same food that we've eaten for generations, but a couple of the proteins within their genome have been swapped out of tens of thousands. And again, because of selective breeding, our diet is full of these GMOs, even though we might not know it. Unless you're eating wild berries and hunting animals, your food has been genetically modified tens of thousands of years ago. Again, the only difference is now we do this in a lab instead of doing it out in the fields. But for a variety of reasons, some people are scared of GMOs because it's a new technology. Being able to do this in a lab is new, so some people are afraid of the consequences of it. They think we don't know the long-term impacts. We don't know what this might look like down the road, so let's take a cautious approach, which is fair, but to this point, there is no scientific evidence that GMOs pose any health risk. And at this point, GMOs are not a new phenomena either. So this is a picture here of the first genetically modified food to be approved by the FDA. It's the flavor saver tomato that was approved in 1994. So this tomato here, again, it grows bigger. Maybe the color of it's a little more attractive for people to buy it in the supermarket. But the rest of the food is the exact same. It's the same nutritional value. It's the same food that you would ever have bought before. Just again, a couple of those proteins have been swapped out. And there are lots of benefits to using GMOs. Even more so than the selective breeding techniques we saw in the Green Revolution, GMOs allow for even higher crop yields by exploiting genetic advantages, allowing these crops to be more disease resistant, more drought resistant, and more herbicide resistant. It allows crops to grow more quickly and more plentiful, so we don't have to wait as long after planting seeds to actually get the food from them. And this reduces the need for pesticides and herbicides. So thinking back to the Green Revolution, again, one of the downsides was that these pesticides, in some cases, have negative impacts on human health. Well, if you can breed a crop to not taste good to insects, then you don't need to use pesticides anymore. You can grow the crop that's been genetically modified to not be attractive to those animals or to those pests, and then you don't need to use pesticides. And almost all studies comparing GMOs to quote-unquote regular food or food that hasn't been genetically modified in the lab show absolutely no difference on their effect on human health. So there's a very wide scientific consensus in the scientific community that GMOs are safe to eat. There's very little evidence, in fact, no credible evidence that GMOs are bad for your health. But that doesn't mean that there's not criticisms of GMOs. So critics of GMOs claim that the long-term health effects are unknown or harmful. Again, there's not really any scientific evidence to back this up, and at this point we've been eating genetically modified foods for over 2 decades, and there's no long-term studies which are showing any negative impacts. There are other risks though. So there's a problem with monocultures. Again, this is a crop which has very little genetic variety. And since there's no genetic diversity, disease could potentially wipe out a whole crop. So one example of a crop which is a monoculture is bananas. In fact, all the bananas you find today that you buy at the store are genetically identical to each other. They're clones of each other. The problem with this, though, is that if a disease was to come around, they could wipe out the entire banana crop because through Darwinian evolution, there's no differences between them. So that disease, which would kill one of them, would kill all of them. There's none that would survive to then pass on their genes with that disease resistance. And this has actually happened to banana crops before. In fact, the variety of banana that we eat today is different than the banana crop we ate in the 1960s. You might have noticed if you've ever eaten banana-flavored candies, they don't taste like bananas do. That's because that candy is based on the flavor of the banana varieties that were around 50, 60 years ago, not the ones that are around today. So there's a risk inherent with using these monocultures. Some people would also be concerned of the risk of GMOs infecting wild crop populations. Again, if we bred these crops to be more disease resistant and more drought resistant and they can grow faster, they might take over and wipe out these wild crop populations just through plain old evolution. There are also social concerns to do with GMOs. So there's the concerns around farmers and the intellectual property of seeds. So one very famous company, Monsanto, they're a large agriculture company. They are very strict about protecting intellectual property of their seeds. They consider their seeds to be a copyright. So if a farmer were to accidentally plant some of their seeds, they would treat that the same as if you were to, steal Apple's patent on the iPod or the iPhone. They think of it the exact same way. And there have been many cases where you have kind of the small-time farmer next to the big agribusiness. The seeds from the big farm blow over to the small farmers. They start growing on their property, and Monsanto goes in and says you're growing our crop. You're being sued. So this is an issue. This is a social issue that we have to deal with. And some critics argue that GMO foods should be labeled in stores. So consumers have the right to make a choice. That if they aren't comfortable with eating GMO foods, they should have the right to not eat them and be able to tell which foods are genetically modified and which foods aren't. And this has been done in many jurisdictions around the world. So this map here is showing where there are restrictions on GMOs. So the countries in the green, so this includes the entire European Union, Russia, China, Australia, Brazil, and a few other countries. There's mandatory labeling of GMO products. The countries in the red ban all import and cultivation of GMOs. And there have been proposals to, again, to make these restrictions in other countries as well. So in some American states, so for example, Vermont, they actually passed a law in 2016 that required mandatory GMO labeling. And there's been some referendums in other states throughout the 2000s, but many of these were defeated. In Canada, Health Canada is in charge of this. Their position is that GMOs are safe and don't require any additional labeling. And again, this is in line with the scientific community, but again, there's these social concerns that people have surrounding GMOs. So in summary, today you learned that hunger, undernutrition, and malnutrition affect just under 800 million people every day, mostly in the developing world. The Green Revolution was a series of agricultural and technological advancements that took place between the 1940s and the 1960s in Pakistan, India, and Mexico. GMOs are any food that has been genetically modified to produce a desirable trait. And while the Green Revolution and GMOs have dramatically increased food production, there are many critics of these practices.